Hello, Anthropology 2300 students. This is your professor, Adam Dunstan, and John is leading the class today as our TA. Let's everyone give John a round of applause. Very good, very good. Hope you're all having a wonderful week, and again, thank you for being understanding that I've been teaching from home, so to speak, this week. I will be back on Monday and very much looking forward to it. Now, I know that some of you have been missing my drawings, and so here's one of my drawings. No, I'm just kidding. This is the Sistine Chapel, but beautiful artwork. Let's take a little glance at that. Very good. Announcements. First of all, the midterm is October 12th, 2015 in class, so that is coming up very, very soon. In fact, that is, let me look at that. So that's not this upcoming Monday, but the Monday after, so that is so close. So you have time to come into my office hours next week. Please use that time to come in if there are any concepts that you have questions about. Second of all, our reading for next week is going to be Ferraro chapter 13, and specifically we'll be talking about politics. We'll be talking about different political systems that are found in different cultures, ranging from the very complex to the very basic. And we will be talking as well about social control as a general concept, as well as people's resistance to control, which is one of my favorite topics. So it's going to be a good time. Now, we concluded last time talking about the little acronym I made up called PRICE. And PRICE is basically just 5 different factors that sort of add complexity to the economy that we find ourselves in beyond just sort of simple supply-demand stuff. Now, one of them is politics, as we talked about. So politics, I used the example, I believe, last time of the Cuban trade embargo, which was only recently ended under President Obama. But the Cuban trade embargo changed a lot of different things in terms of economic relationships, so it wasn't just simply sort of a free market trading relationship between Cuba and the U.S. That's why things like Cuban cigars became a highly valued commodity for a while. Politics come into play in things like tariffs. They come into play when certain countries freeze other countries' assets as a result of international tensions. It comes into play with trade agreements. It comes into play with subsidies as well. And it comes into play even when we tax certain things that are politically unpopular, perhaps, such as tobacco. So in all of this, we see that the economy doesn't just sort of stand as its own self-perpetuating organism, but in fact it's interestingly interlinked and interlocked with politics. And indeed, we use the term political economy to get at the idea that politics, law, and economy are all connected together and influence each other. So although the economy may have certain things like supply and demand that sort of can occur, reoccurring patterns, these patterns are not in a vacuum, right? There's other things that are impinging upon and affecting the economy. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about the idea of free markets. You know, in the U.S., we oftentimes distinguish between conservatives and liberals, and far-left liberals and far-right conservatives, based on their adherence to sort of free market principles versus maybe more socialistic principles, or maybe more mixed principles, more liberal principles if you're getting kind of into the middle left. And when we talk about free markets, if you ask Americans, a lot of Americans on the street would say, yeah, we have a free market, right? Free country, free market, etc. And then they would say, well, communist nations have like a government-controlled economy. The reality is actually that it's usually much more complicated than that. The vast majority of nations are somewhere in between government controlling the economy and government having no influence on the economy. So, for example, the USSR, United Soviet Socialist Republics, they were a communist, ideologically nation. However, there was capitalistic aspects to them, including how they marketed agricultural products. The USA, conversely, has lots of private businesses, private corporations, and people often think of the US as a like uber capitalistic, uber free market. And yet, there are aspects of our economy that are not free market at all and very much controlled by the government. A great example is roads, right? Roads are not a free market in the United States, although there are toll roads and a lot of toll roads in Texas, unfortunately. Well, I shouldn't say unfortunately, just it takes some getting used to when you move here. Anyways, although there are toll roads here, by and large our road systems are public roads, right? So it's not free market in that sense. Similarly, our school system is not just sort of K through 12, theoretically, any American citizen is guaranteed that education and doesn't sort of have to purchase it on the open market, right? So there's a lot of ways in which our economy is not as free as one might think. And so that kind of brings up an interesting point. So a lot of times people will say, well, we don't want to move the economy in a socialist direction, a state-run direction, and they fail to realize that there are already a lot of state-run things in our economy, school systems being a great example. However, the question is then how far we want to mix the government in with the economy, and that's where we get a lot of our political divisions. But I think there are relatively few people that are truly saying that they want no government hand in the economy. A second factor that you have to take into account that causes economies to be different is redistribution, taxation being perhaps one of the most prominent ones. In taxation, funding finances, hold on just a second. Sorry about that. In redistribution, in taxation, money and capital is flowing towards the government and then being spent on other projects. And so the government spends that money, for example, on roads. It spends a significant amount of that money on defense and on the military. It spends a certain amount of that money on social welfare programs. It spends a significant amount of that money on social security programs. It spends some of that money on senators' salaries. There's a lot of different places that the money goes once it's been funneled towards the government. And the question is that sort of just a pure free market? Obviously not. And would American citizens vote with their dollars, so to speak, to spend money on those specific things? Potentially not, which is indeed one of the reasons that we have taxation. One of the reasons that taxation exists is because it is often assumed that the public on their own is not going to choose to all invest money into something that doesn't profit them but just helps society. And so for that reason, taxation sort of forces us all to pay into the system so that there's no freeloaders. Because you can imagine that there'd be problems if we all voluntarily chose to pay for the police, right? Some people would choose to get the police protection or the advantage of living in a society with police, if you view that as an advantage, yet would choose not to pay into the system, and so you'd get freeloaders. So taxation is essentially a way of forcing everyone to put money towards certain projects defined by the government. However, sometimes when we talk about things like pork barrel projects or things like that, we get at the idea that there are certain things that the government potentially spends money on that the average American citizen would most likely not want their money going towards, which is why redistribution becomes a very important factor in society of sending money in unexpected places. This is just a funny little cartoon. It's obviously just meant to be entertaining. Farm subsidies is another example of this. So that really shouldn't go under taxation so much as tax exemptions. Well, no, there's overt subsidies, so I guess we could put that under redistribution. Anyways, subsidies to American farmers is a significant part of the way that the U.S. agricultural system works, and it is one of the most productive agricultural systems in the world, where we produce just massive amounts of food. But one of the reasons we're able to do that is because there are fairly substantial subsidies from the U.S. government to farmers that allow them, for example, as the book points out, to sometimes even grow crops in areas where it's not very economically practical compared to maybe third world countries, but still get a profit for them. Subsidies to oil companies, coal companies, different things like that, as well as subsidies to alternative energy is another example of redistribution, potentially. Vice taxes is another way in which there's redistribution, so basically penalizing people beyond the market value for things like tobacco and then putting that towards something else. A third thing that we have to take into account in understanding how economies behave, and again, all of this PRICE, this whole acronym, they all have to do with basically putting culture and society back into the economy and considering how that stuff affects economic forces. The third one that I wanted to talk about is inequality. Inequality is an incredibly complicated issue that I'm not going to have enough time to fully address. We will most likely return to this throughout the semester. However, the one thing I want to point out now is that it is often easy for people to assume, kind of under a certain ideology, that the economy is a perfectly level playing field in which all people have equal opportunities, and that if you work hard enough, you will be able to get wealthy. And although there are certainly people that are able to work and achieve success and get out of poverty, one of the things that social scientists have pointed out in study after study is that inequality, economic inequality especially, can have reverberating impacts down generations or for entire groups of people that make it not a level playing field and make it so that certain groups of people are much less likely, even if they work just crazy hours, to ever get out of poverty. And there are multiple reasons for this. So with economic inequality, we don't just see that there are people that make less money than other people, but we see, for one thing, access to education being affected, and that certain school districts, if they're not getting as much tax dollars from their area, the school system has less money to invest in teachers and in education, and as a result, you get education that's not as good, for example. Well, I shouldn't say not as good, that's kind of a value judgment, but I should say education that does not have as much money going towards it in poorer areas compared to sort of wealthy or upper middle class areas. So educational disparity, which then affects things like whether or not people are prepared to go to college, encouraged to go to college, given the resources to go to college even if they want to. And that's a disparity that causes inequality to some degree to be perpetuating. And that's a structural factor, by which I mean it's part of the structure of our society as it currently stands. So long as we have schools and education set up the way it is, that is a structural factor that works to, in a sense, perpetuate inequality. And that's important to recognize, because a lot of times the narrative surrounding poverty or wealth disparity centers on individuals and whether or not individuals are willing to work. And although certainly there are people that are unwilling to work, and that's why they aren't able to gain wealth, there are a whole lot of people who have less wealth because of structural factors that we need to look at to be good social scientists. And again, many social scientific studies have shown us that there's a whole host of structural factors that influences who gets ahead and who doesn't. One of them is, of course, just accidents of birth. Were you born to the family of somebody that had significant capital or not? If you were, they'd be more likely to be able to send you to really challenging private school, for example, get you private tutoring. They'd be more likely to give you money to start a business if you wanted to after you get out of college, things like that, or get you a job with their business. So wealth, again, can tend to be perpetuating, and that's part of the reasons that we get classes, which we'll talk about later in the semester, but distinct stratum of society that over generations are able to pass wealth and maintain more access to resources than people in lower classes, thus the term upper class, middle class, lower class, working class. Other forms of structural factors and inequality factors include degree of environmental protection. So I work on a body of work called environmental justice. And in environmental justice, we look at how being poor or being a minority in the United States makes you much more at risk of environmental harm. The reason being that oftentimes environmentally destructive practices, such as power plants, such as hazardous waste sites, are located in areas that are very rural, very inner city, very poor, have high levels of minorities, Native American reservations, things like that. Typically more upper middle class and wealthier neighborhoods, and particularly where there are a lot of Caucasian people, these are the types of neighborhoods that have been able to successfully lobby against hazardous waste sites and power plants being put in their area, among other things. And they're also ones that tend to live in more suburban areas away from these types of projects. And oftentimes these environmentally destructive projects that can lead to things like significant respiratory health problems or cancer rates or things like that tend to be located close, again, to minority communities or poorer communities. Access to job opportunities. This is a significant thing here. And indeed, that's another way in which class can be self-perpetuating. We all know that networking is an incredibly important part of how people get, obtain, and promote within jobs. And if your network is a bunch of other wealthy people, that tends to be more advantageous for gaining wealth than a network of other lower class people. So there are underlying cultural, social, institutional causes that feed into inequality. I've barely scratched the surface here. There are many more that we could get into. A very obvious one that here it is. I was going to say I'm surprised I didn't put down, is of course discrimination as well as racism as one subset of discrimination. And so anytime that there's people that are not hiring people based on their perception of that person's race or their skin pigmentation, that is an example of a structural factor relating to inequality, right? There's something that's causing inequality that has nothing to do with the individual applying for the job. Rather, they're not getting a job because of their race, right? So there's a discourse or rhetoric of racism that's causing that. And discrimination based on sexuality, discrimination based on gender or on sex, discrimination based on identity, discrimination based on religion, discrimination based on disability. These are all things that we've observed in the economy and that can have very serious impacts on how people are able to gain access and get their basic needs met. Colonialism is another critical factor here. So I do a lot of work with Native American reservations, and particularly the Navajo Nation. And what we see with a lot of reservations is that there are high levels of poverty. That's not true of every reservation, but that's true of some, certainly significant levels of poverty. And people say, oh, why can't Native Americans get out of that poverty? But you look at the situation, you see that this is a nation of people that were colonized by another group of people, oftentimes given either displaced to another area of land or given a much less valuable piece of land or a smaller piece of land so that their traditional subsistence was disrupted. So then they're forced to get into a new kind of economy, and oftentimes there's racism within that economy so that they're less likely to get jobs, or there are a whole host of other effects. Theoretically, they can't own private land on the reservation because it's held in trust by the federal government, which means that they can't have land as capital to build new businesses. There's just a whole lot of different effects that make it so that it's much harder to start businesses and generate wealth within Native American reservations. One of the reasons that gaming/casinos has had to be an important way of trying to get a leg up. And so, when people say things like, oh, why can't people on the reservation just get out of poverty? It's kind of like saying, as my wife has pointed out, why can't you just build brick houses with all the trees that you have lying around? If you take away all the materials to get out of poverty, how are you going to expect people to do that? And oftentimes colonialism extracts resources from people. It takes natural resources to make a profit. Outside companies come into a reservation and take significant amounts of, say, uranium or timber. Don't give the reservation very much money for it. Again, you're taking things and not giving people a lot of opportunity to self-economically develop. Or they're isolated, or there's racism that they face. Whatever it is, there's all these different structural factors that are causing poverty on the reservation beyond any individual desires to work or not. So you can have somebody that would love to work and cannot find a job for that reason. So colonialism, as I kind of jumped the gun on that one. So we talked about, again, politics, redistribution, inequality, colonialism. Colonialism is a significant impact on economies and how economies operate. And indeed, we see the ongoing reverberations of colonialism all across the globe, because European empires at one point had colonized most of South America, most of Africa, parts of the Middle East, much of Asia, though not all of it, and all of Australia and Southeast Asia. So countries like these were, for several hundred years, used primarily as places to draw, quote, resources from, whether humans were being treated as resources and commodified, which is incredibly tragic, natural resources, whatever it was, resources being drawn and then essentially being converted into wealth for European nations or for European settlers. There's ongoing reverberations of that, especially when we talk about groups that are still partially ruled or fully ruled by colonial powers, or when we just talk about groups that have had sort of shattering impacts from colonialism that last to this day. So I'm going to actually just change it up and put another C in here on this PRICE, which is class, and we already talked about that, but perpetual cycles of wealth. Wealth generating wealth for people. People that are in wealth tending to get better educational opportunities and continue to get more wealth. Embeddedness is the last factor I wanted to talk about within PRICE. Embeddedness refers to the fact, again, that the economy is part of a broader cultural and social life, and so people will make decisions based on other than economic factors. A good example of this, of course, is, again, anonymous donations. but there are countless other examples. The potlatch that we talked about was a really good example. People do not make economic decisions solely based on what will maximize their own self-interest. They oftentimes make decisions based on what will help other people, what will help their family, what they feel is morally right. There are countless reasons that people make other decisions other than their own self-interest, and that affects how the economy plays out. When we add all of these things together, politics, redistribution and taxation, inequality and all the different things that cause it, colonialism and class, and embeddedness, we see that the economy is an instituted phenomenon, something that is affected by social institutions and does not just stand on its own. It's something that's affected by the decisions of politicians, the value systems of religious people. All these different factors affect the economy. By the way, if we want to talk a little bit about that, one book that you might find interesting is Max Weber's book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. And he talks about how Protestantism drove people to, because of some certain beliefs that it has, drove people to accumulate more and more wealth over their Catholic counterparts in sort of 1800s Europe and early 1900s Europe. Fascinating book, definitely worth a read, and it once again brings up this idea of embeddedness, the idea that an economy can be affected by religion even, right? So it's connected to all these other parts of society. You can't consider it in isolation. So we've talked now at this point about production and distribution, and we've talked about how the third kind of part of an economy is, of course, patterns of or systems of consumption, which is basically addressing the issue of once we produce stuff and once people have taken possession of stuff, how is it used or consumed? What social factors guide that consumption, and why do people consume it in the way that they consume it? This is just a funny billboard. Material possessions won't make you happy, or maybe they will. I wanted to check the time really quickly. Thank you for that. So globalization is one thing that affects consumption, mainly along the lines of globalization, and we've talked about this earlier in the lecture, but globalization allows people to buy products from across the globe and get them shipped to them. And one of the implications of that is that in a much more dramatic way than ever before, people can take part in the consumer goods of other cultures. Now, this has always been happening to some degree. You had the Silk Road, which used to connect Europe and Asia in terms of trade goods, and indeed, the Europeans eventually discovered the New World in part because they were finding an alternative trade route to Asia. Not that they'd never had a trade route to Asia, but they wanted a different trade route other than the Silk Road. But anyways, so cross-nation, cross-cultural trade's been going on for a really long time. However, it's been accelerated and the scope has been so much more broadened through globalization. And so you can buy, whether that's Native American art online, or Japanese manga comic books, right? Or some specialty wine from France, Amazon, internet technology, all of these things have radically reshaped what we can consume. And then that also brings up issues of appropriation and consumer goods moving outside of their context and then taking on new meanings in new cultures. And so an example of that would be dream catchers, which started in a very specific tribal context. Not even all Native American cultures had those. That's very specific tribes that even had dream catchers, but whose meaning has now gone way beyond what it traditionally meant as it's been consumed by non-indigenous people. Another example is yoga, right? Although it's kind of funny to think of that as something that gets consumed because it's more like a technique, but if we think of it as like, yoga videos, yoga instruction is a commodity. Yoga is something that originally arises out of Hinduism as a very methodical religious technique with very spiritual overtones and very explicitly religious overtones. However, eventually gets consumed by Americans, sometimes with some spirituality and sometimes just as an exercise technique. So the decoupling of consumer goods from their original cultural context means they can be radically reinterpreted by the culture receiving that good. Now, while we're talking about consumption, I wanted to talk a little bit about the idea of affluence, the idea of wealth. There's two ways really to achieve wealthiness. One of them, I should say wealthiness, not wealth, because that's a little more complicated. So there's two ways essentially to be well off or affluent. as according to Marshall Sahlins, a famous economic anthropologist. He said you can produce much or desire little. Again, produce much or desire little. So the way that in the West or in industrialized societies like the United States or Canada, the way we try to be well off is by getting stuff, right? Get a job that will pay you a lot of money so that you can get a lot of your stuff and have your needs and desires met. But conversely, another way to feel as if you're well off is to not want very many things and thus feel satisfied because you didn't expect very much, so the amount of stuff that you have is just fine. And that is indeed what we see with certain cultures, and particularly hunter-gatherer societies. Johann Z. Bushman, and I know I always go back to that example, but they're so good for illustrating many different principles. They have extremely few, traditionally, they had extremely few material possessions, but that wasn't part of their culture to have a lot of material possessions. So if that's not part of your culture, not having a lot of stuff, that's fine. You don't feel as if you're in poverty, which brings up the idea that there are aspects of what we call poverty that we could objectively delineate. So when people are not getting enough to eat, not getting enough to drink, not getting good shelter, not getting good health care, these we could consider objective markers of poverty. However, there are other things that we consider poverty that it kind of depends on the culture you're part of. Is it poverty to not have a car? Is it poverty to not have two cars, right? Kind of depends on what your culture tells you is the expectation of stuff that you're supposed to have. But consumption is complicated in that way because it has to do so much with people's desires and what they want. Consumption is also interesting anthropologically because consumption is often a way that we mark out and delineate our own identities. So within social groups, people want to identify themselves as, I am this is me, this is who I am within this group. And then entire groups want to mark, hey, we are this, we are American as opposed to Canadian, or we are French as opposed to German, right? And so consumption, having certain material possessions, using certain material possessions becomes a very visible way of marking, I am this. So, sort of, let me think of a good example of this. Why am I having such a hard time thinking of a good example of this? So certain types of, I was going to say American clothing, but American clothing has now become so standardized throughout the world, used by so many different people, that it's kind of stopped being a marker of Americanness per se. But we could think of a lot of different things here. Sorry, I'm blanking on them right now. But one of the things that I wanted to bring up with identity marking is within a culture, subcultures often identity mark or showcase and make visible what identity they are, what group they belong to through their goods, through their objects. I have a picture here of hipsters. It says it takes a lot of effort to look like you don't care. I'm sorry, I always pick on hipsters. It's not fair. They're just sort of the subculture right now that's easy to point out. If this was a 1960s anthropology class, we'd be pointing out hippies. There's a lot of different groups we could point out. Point is, subcultures in our culture oftentimes mark who they are by consumer goods. And so there's specific types of clothing items, plaids, certain kind of glasses that tend to go along with being a hipster, and so that becomes an identification mark. Now, does that mean that every person wearing those things is a hipster? Of course not, but it means that that becomes a very visible way of expressing that identity. This can be true for religious people as well, religious subcultures. So we all get very quickly what it means if somebody's wearing a cross on a necklace. Now, are there people that wear crosses on a necklace that aren't Christian? Of course. However, it's a consumption. It's a way of using a material object to show what identity you are and also to express your religious identity and belief. This also gets to the idea of conspicuous consumption, which is basically when we consume stuff and can specifically spend a lot of wealth or resources to consume things that make us look to be high class or higher socially perhaps than we are, or maybe to put us above other people. And so, this whole keeping up with the Joneses idea, buying an extremely expensive car to showcase wealth, or an extremely large house. The potlatch, some have argued, is an example of conspicuous consumption. So there's not just conspicuous consumption in American society. Don't think that we invented that. However, it is sometimes very prominent here. The idea of using material goods to showcase the idea of I am wealthy, I am well off, which really kind of gets at underlying cultural ideas. the idea of maybe I'm intelligent, I'm resourceful, I'm able to get a lot of money, I have a good job, I'm hardworking, all these sort of cultural messages that we're trying to send when we intentionally buy things that are very expensive. And indeed, we can see conspicuous consumption even in very minor things. When you buy Pop-Tarts as opposed to generic brand Pop-Tarts, or toaster pastries, I should say, at the grocery store, with an eye to the fact that somebody's going to be coming by your house and you don't want to be judged for buying the cheaper product, that can be regarded as conspicuous consumption, particularly when you have food items that taste about the same. Okay, so having thought about it more, I've decided that my example of marking group identity with a type of clothing is going to be Texas cowboy style clothing, which of course lots of Texas people don't wear, but it's interesting that as soon as you get to, like, when I drove into Texas, specifically into Denton County, you have places where they sell this prodigiously, and of course that's partly for tourists, right, as a way of marking, like, I was there, I was part of that group. But then also you do see in certain parts of the country far more people wearing cowboy boots, rural clothing, right, as well, kind of ranch style clothing, sometimes cowboy hats, cowboy belt buckles, things like that, as a way of marking group identity. Anyways, thank you. So the other thing I wanted to mention with consumption is detachedness, and just linking this back to our lecture from last week, the extreme amount of detachedness that we have towards food. On the right, I have a picture of, groceries that we might get at the grocery store, and it's all packaged, right? And it's all processed, and it's put in bags, and it's transformed, and it's got chemicals in it. So it's really hard to remember, for example, where corn pop comes from, even though it's in the name, a potato chip, even though it's in the name, or maple syrup, even though it's in the name. And certainly sometimes when we see meat, we really don't connect where that's coming from. And sort of my example of that is I come from a family which does hunting, and I remember quite clearly that I had experiences in high school where people would really get upset and judgmental about that. And yet many of these people, like most Americans, presumably eat meat. They just don't connect the fact that the meat that they're eating at the grocery store or at Burger King comes from an animal. And in fact, comes typically from an animal that was factory farmed, as opposed to hunting where it was an animal that at least had some time out in the wild, right? And so there's generally kind of a disconnect with a lot of Americans about where their food comes from, and indeed that's much of the industrialized world. It's very easy to forget that the food that we eat has to come from somewhere. Another issue with consumption, and it's oftentimes marketed in such a way to seem very clean, very precise. Produce that is like slightly looks off is oftentimes either thrown away or sold somewhere else or something like that. There's very much this idea of a standardization of what food is supposed to look like, which is a very important part of consumption and production. There's a couple authors' works on consumption that I thought you might find really interesting and I wanted to bring out. Sorry, this is almost kind of like popcorn, just this thing about consumption as opposed to production and distribution. We're more organized. But consumption has a lot of different angles you could go at with it. Here's a couple of examples. James Watson edited a volume called Golden Arches East, which I highly recommend, in which he talks about how McDonald's has been marketed and received and understood and consumed by people in several different Southeast Asian and more so East Asian countries, Korea, China, Taiwan, etc. And one of the issues he gets at is that different parts of East Asia have understood it differently. Some as this is a way of seeming American. You consume McDonald's to seem more westernized, and in that way it's kind of social mobility. It's seeming more upper class by seeming more Western, right? Other places it's regarded more as a very Chinese thing, and indeed people may or may not even be aware that McDonald's is an American company. It talks about in some parts of East Asia where McDonald's are places where teenagers hang out for hours on end. It's not fast food by any stretch of the imagination, but in fact much more of sort of how we treat cafes. And so consume is kind of the same product, really. I mean, there's minor differences, but to some degree the same product being marketed and consumed in vastly different ways in different cultural contexts, which shows you that different cultures and different histories influence how people consume the same goods and what meanings they attach to them. And that's really what we want to get at with consumption, is that people attach different meanings to the goods that they consume, and that they don't just do things to benefit themselves materially, but we often consume things because we want to do something socially or culturally. We want to send a message about who we are, we want to make ourselves feel a certain way, have a certain experience, things like that. Another example of this is Robert Foster's work on Coca-Cola and Pepsi. He wrote a book called Coca Globalization, and he talks about, among other things, how Coke has been able to become like the main hydration provider in certain parts of India and Africa. Very weird politics that I won't go into. But another thing that he's looked at, not so much in that book but elsewhere, is how Coca-Cola and Pepsi marketed themselves in New Guinea through TV ads. And specifically, he noted that Pepsi had a TV commercial where there was somebody like rollerblading, and it was blue tinged because, it's Pepsi rather than the red of Coke. And this person seemed very like kind of westernized and modern, drinking their Pepsi. Whereas Coca-Cola ran an ad where they had a Coca-Cola machine drop out of the sky into a traditional New Guinean village, kind of reminiscent of cargo drops from back in the day. And ultimately, Coca-Cola was much more successful in their marketing to New Guineans than Pepsi was, because they were sending a message of, yes, we're something new and outside, but we're also something in line with your history and your experiences with the West and your values. Whereas Pepsi was kind of implicitly, with this sort of rollerblading, hip, modern person, sending a message of, you need to be more Western or modern to take part in our product. I also wanted to get at the idea of the importance that cultural expectations can have in business. This isn't just about consumption, but this is a convenient place to put the slide. So here we go. Your book talked about Walmart in Germany and the different expectations that people had, one of which was that the whole Walmart greeter system that we're very familiar with seemed like it was flirtatious in the German cultural context, right? So this is where we really have to think about marketing. If you're at all interested in business or marketing, one of the things you want to think about is localization, mainly, translating things into the language, making it look more similar to that culture, but then also sort of cross-cultural relevancy, and how are you marketing and making sure that this makes sense to the people you're marketing towards. Again, back to that Coca-Cola Pepsi example. Sometimes something sends one message in your culture. So for example, the Walmart greeters seem like they're being really friendly and helpful in the US, and in another culture that's coming across again as flirtatious in the German context. There's also issues with how they regarded unions. Ultimately, Walmart had to pull out of Germany, was very unsuccessful there. Another good example from the reading was about the US business people that were meeting with Japanese business people, rolled up their sleeves to show that they were like getting down to business, and indeed this was sending completely the wrong message, that they were being too informal. And then another book that I would recommend is The Culture Code by Clotaire Rapaille, who's a cultural anthropologist who consults with various Fortune 500 companies, and including Jeep is one of the groups he's worked with. And he really gets at helping them figure out how to market and what, in different parts of the world, how the product that they're selling is understood, and how to market things to make sense to that culture. So Jeep isn't marketed the same way, say, in Europe, where there's memories of Jeeps as part of, the American Liberating Force in France. That means you're going to market Jeeps to sort of fit that sort of historical legacy, versus the US, where we market Jeeps to sort of tie into like cowboy culture. So different cultures are going to have really different meanings they attach to products, and part of what the Culture Code as a book is about is trying to understand the underlying message that people have with a product in their mind, the underlying cultural assumption. So all these examples get to the idea that when we're consuming things, when we're marketing things for consumption as well, which is part of distribution and exchange, and then also when people are choosing to consume them, which is part of consumption, on both ends of that equation, there's meanings going on. And when it's cross-cultural, sometimes the meanings get crossed and it doesn't go well. But sometimes if the meanings do go well, people understand each other well and a transaction occurs. Anthropology can have, again, sorry, this is just sort of popcorn, I'm jumping topics here. Anthropology can have significant business applications. This kind of showed that with Kotaro Ropai's work. We also see this in product design. And it's cool that you get to go to UNT because we in fact have two very pioneering anthropologists in this specific field at our university, in our department, two of my colleagues. One of them is Dr. Susan Squires, who you read about in the book and how she helped design Go-Gurt based on what American mothers and children wanted out of their breakfast meals, right? Dr. Susan Squires, you could go see her. She teaches in our department. She's over there at Chilton Hall. And so she helped design that using the tools of anthropology to get at, sort of participant observation, getting at beyond what people say they want out of breakfast, the actual experience they have. And then Dr. Christina Wasson, this is a link you can go to. She, along with some of our grad students in our Applied Anthropology Master's program, has been looking at this whole phenomena of self-driving cars that you've probably been hearing about, like Google and people developing self-driving cars. So Christina Wasson and some grad students looked at how people use cars, what different things they do while they're driving cars, what kind of distracted things they do, whether that's talking on the phone, changing the radio station, etc. Really taking detailed log of how people use cars and then using that as sort of a baseline for how people might behave towards cars that are now driving themselves. And so anthropology can have a really important place in designing products for the market because it can get at the human dimension and how people use things, how they consume things. Now I wanted to talk a little bit about this Black Cat Cafe reading, which I think is a really fascinating one and a good place to end talking about consumption. So let me actually pull up that document, and away we will go. Let me make sure that everything's still recording properly. It is indeed. So I had you read The Raw and the Rotten, Punk Cuisine by Dylan Clark, found in a fairly famous anthropology journal, Ethnology, produced in 2004. I thought it was a really good article, and I hope that you enjoyed it. It seems like you did, from what little I've heard from people through the 3 questions. Now, what was going on with this whole Black Cat Cafe? Well, I think on its most simple level, the Black Cat Cafe was obviously a home or a place for food, and it was a place specifically for punk people to consume food. But specifically, the way they consumed food and the way they reacted to other people's consumption of food shows that consuming food is about much more than just putting food in your belly, and that there's different meanings that are attached to food. So I'm going to pull out a few different quotes that I think were interesting. One of them is that being punk is a way of critiquing privilege and challenging social hierarchies, generally inspired by anarchism, talking about environmentalism, works against sexism, racism, and corporate domination. So the punk people in Seattle that were being studied are part of a broader movement that's really anti-corporation, anti-hierarchy, oftentimes has themes of anarchism or anti-governmentness. Now, oops, sorry about that. Or about the idea that we don't need a state government and could have more self-governing institutions. Now, the important point here, I think, is this. Food practices mark ideological moments. Eating is a cauldron for the dominion of states, races, genders, ideology, and the practice through which these discourses are resisted. So consumption of food becomes a place both where messages are sent to people and people are made more in line with the status quo, and it's also a place where people resist the status quo. So these are people, as it says, that are ardent critics of civilization and that associate civilization with, sexism, patriarchy, anti-environmentalism, overconsumption of natural resources, corporate domination, etc., etc. And so that's, that works as a political ideology. That's their idea as a social ideology. But it's interesting to see how that plays out in their consumption of food. So many associated. So the author talks about this culinary triangle. This comes from Levi-Strauss, an important early anthropologist, and, sort of mid-1900s anthropologist. Anyways, he talked about that food can kind of come in 3 varieties that have symbolic meanings in cultures: raw, cooked, and rotten. Now, cooked food is usually associated in many cultures with this is a sign that something is civilized, or civilization or culture, is once we take food from nature as raw and turn it into cooked food. And indeed, we human beings just can't stomach certain kinds of raw food and we need to cook them. And generally, rotten food would be regarded very negatively, right, as cooked food that has gone bad. However, this was all flipped on its head by the Black Cat Cafe. So, for example, they rejected commodification, as it said, and they specifically saw food as it was consumed in modern supermarkets as totally an outgrowth of capitalism, corporations, factory farming, this stuff that is carefully packaged and has a bunch of chemicals in it. That very hygienicness, that very clean, neat, and orderliness that many of us desire in our food, they saw as sort of a hallmark or a sign of all the things that they kind of hated out of mainstream status quo society, and indeed were trying to fight against. Generally, it talks a little bit about feminist practice within this movement, which I think is really important, and the different ways in which food can be seen as reinforcing patriarchal structures. But in general, they were looking at opposing social hierarchies, subverting male supremacy, and that's one of the reasons that vegetarianism was very important. And it talked about veganism, of course, as a way of sort of entirely opting out of the destruction of animals and also the use of land in what they saw as an unsustainable way for meat production, because meat production tends to take more land than vegetable production. There's some complicated environmental reasons for that. Just take my word on it for now. So consuming only vegan foods allowed them to make a statement and also opt out of a system which was abusing the environment in their view. Now, the key point here is that the degree to which food is processed, sterilized, brand named, and fetishized is the degree to which it's corrupted from their perspective. So things that are cooked, which in many societies, including mainstream US society, is a good thing and a sign that something is ready for human consumption, to them when something was cooked, it was a sign of its corruption, its connection with capitalism, with patriarchy, with oppression, with genetic engineering, commodification, pesticides, animal cottages, etc., etc., and the sign of sort of the dominant classes. Now, another category of food that they dealt with was raw food, and indeed it talks a little bit about this because there was certain sort of more whole foods, kind of natural foods sold at the natural grocers there. What was the actual name of that natural grocery store? I'm not sure I'm going to be able to find it quickly, but the point is, you would think that they would like this because on one level this was often more whole grain, organic food, etc. that's more in line with how they think that farming and food production should be done. However, it was highly marketed, they felt like predominantly to upper class and upper middle class white people, and it was more so less about escaping hierarchy and oppression and more so about sort of feeding the ego and being seen to be eating natural food. And so they very much critiqued this. Now, that food, that raw food, that more natural food from that grocery store was co-opted and made back into something useful by theft, by direct stealing of it, in which case they were taking it out of sort of capitalist exchange and making it into more truly raw food and food that they highly valued. But perhaps even more important than raw food was rotten food to them, and it talked about dumpster diving. And this is a very important concept, and indeed in my experience with punk people, I myself have been the recipient of food that is the result of dumpster diving, and it's done sometimes because people literally don't have the resources, but sometimes because people are attempting to, in this way, subvert capitalism. So for example, a bunch of food every single day gets thrown into the dumpsters that's not used. Maybe, for example, just donuts or bread that are just a little bit stale, right? And so reclaiming these from the dumpsters is a very powerful way of fighting against waste and fighting against this whole sort of capitalist society. And that food is oftentimes slightly rotten, is one of the point, or perhaps majorly rotten, the food that they found in the dumpsters. But they actually saw this as a good thing. By consuming it, they were essentially disconnecting themselves from a privileged white/middle class society and becoming more in line with their new identity as punk people. So rottenness actually is seen as a good thing. And indeed, in the Black Cat Cafe, we saw that unlike many restaurants and grocery stores where everything would be about cleanliness and hygiene, people seemed completely fine with a bathroom that reeked, with surfaces that weren't very clean, with people serving the food that maybe looked like they weren't the most cleaned in the world, and same thing with the people consuming the food. In all this regard, we kind of get the idea of rottenness, a lack of order, a lack of cleanliness as a way of opting out of an overly packaged society. So I like this quote: "Contemporary punks, largely anarchist, anti-racist, and feminist, use food as a medium to make themselves, and to theorize and contest the status quo. As an integral part of their daily practices, punks politicize food." So food consumption, in this example, is not just consumption for food ends, for physical well-being, but rather it has a deeper meaning about who they are as a people and what they think matters in society and what needs to be fought against in society, rather, and how they're trying to subvert society. And I think that's a good place to end with consumption, just with the idea that when we're talking about economics, at every single level, production, distribution, and consumption, people's cultural values play a huge role in what happens here, as well as their own social experiences and what they have had to fight against. Thank you very much. That is my lecture. See you Monday, by the way. Extremely excited to be back. Extremely sad to be leaving my wife home alone with the baby, but I'm excited just in the sense that I know probably everybody's getting pretty tired of the online lectures.